The story of Cardinal Becciu and his rather sudden dismissal from the Vatican is a story that is constantly changing, with new details emerging that are leaving the faithful with a lot of questions. None of them are particularly pleasant. I'm going to focus on that story today, and I'm going to attempt to give a solid but brief overview of it as it has developed, with a particular focus on one subject: money. The love of money is the root of all evil, as St. Paul's first letter to Timothy tells us, and money plays an essential role in this story. But I also wanted to let you know that, if you're interested, Archbishop Vigano dropped another letter, this one detailing the role the Jesuits have been playing in, well, pretty much everything else going on right now. It's another one of his letters that's just a little too much for this place, so I put a recording of it over on Garbage Chute and on the audio podcasting host platform, both of which can be found linked on the Sources blog, and I'll put a link to that in the pinned comment to this video. I have no incentive for you to check those out off-site, but they are there if you want to hear them. On to the news that brought you here, though. It turns out that Francis has a personal account, a private account of £20 million, and this account is central to the story at hand. As it turns out, £20 million that came from the papal account were used to fund some of Cardinal Becciu's activity, and without Francis's knowledge. At least that's how the story is being reported. Marco Tosatti asks why Francis has a private fund in this amount to begin with, if it's not even larger. That is a good question. Let's see what Mr. Tossatti's reasoning is. First, Tosatti points out that this isn't exactly a public account, and that it is odd that the fund is in pounds sterling. Why pounds? Tossatti suggests that it might be because Francis has no trust in the stability of the dollar or the euro, and with the news of some of Becciu's activity being the realm of real estate in London, pounds might make sense, though that activity was apparently not done with papal approval. But the question of where this money came from is interesting for obvious reasons, including the fact that the Catholic Church is supposed to be a poor missionary church, with a lot of negative things said about the rich by this pontiff on a pretty regular basis. To give my American audience an idea of how much we're talking about, and most but not all of you are Americans statistically, £20 million sterling is the equivalent of $25,867,000 US dollars. That's a lot of money for a private off-the-books account, and that's what Cardinal Becciu used to fund some of his operations. We don't know how much is actually in there. But think about that, and think about all the things the Vatican has been involved in just the past couple of years. For some reason, Cardinal Zen is also coming to mind right now and his entire situation. An obvious question is this: is it untoward necessarily for a pontiff to have that kind of funds? It really depends on how you think about this. If we conceive of the Pope traditionally as the monarch that he is, then no, it is not. The Pope is many things. He is the Vicar of Christ, the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, the servant of servants, and the list goes on, and this is disregardless of what you might think about Francis and his validity personally. We're talking about the office of the papacy itself. And the papacy is also the supreme monarch of the Vatican City, which is the remnants of an ancient kingdom called the Papal States. While the Papal States technically no longer exist, Vatican City is a city-state that remains one of the most important centers of activity in the world, with deep and ancient ties to the rest of the world. In short, a lot of money historically comes through the Vatican, and the vast majority of it for legitimate purposes. It isn't unreasonable for a monarch to have access to those kinds of funds, at least traditionally. But if you think about this in the context of how Francis talks about the church, a church of the poor, eschewing the external signs of luxury of the papacy, like the red shoes, the tiara, and the rest, then there is something a little off here. There is an image projected by this pontificate of Franciscan poverty, of the poverty of St. Francis of Assisi, that is to be embraced from the highest levels of the church. That is itself supposed to be a clear example for the hierarchy and the laity to embrace and emulate in our own lives. Francis lives not in the traditional papal apartments, which are luxurious and monarchical in nature, but in the equivalent of a guest house. The outward symbols of wealth and power of the papacy have been set aside, with the white cassock of the pontiff, the pectoral cross, and the papal ferula, which is the papal crozier or the shepherd's staff you see him walking with, being the principal remaining symbols, along with seasonally appropriate liturgical attire. There is a lot of power in the employment of symbols and symbolic gestures, like the adoption of poverty as an example. But if these activities are not embraced in the fullest and most honest sense, then the message being sent is something else entirely, which is why this story is probably not getting a lot of coverage from the Catholic opinion-making circles, at least not to the degree that you might expect and hope. But there's another fascinating money angle in the story. As it turns out, Cardinal Becciu sent funds to an Australian account right when Cardinal Pell was having the finer details of his life being examined for his rather famous situation in Australia. That's generally awkward timing, and you'll probably recall if you've been paying attention to that story, he oversaw the Vatican's Secretariat for the Economy and was considered the third highest ranking official in the Vatican. His primary duty was clearing up and making transparent the Vatican's Institute for Religious Works, but his efforts were met with resistance, and it was known that he and Becciu didn't exactly get along well, especially when the subject of transparency and money were the focus. Also, you'll recall that Archbishop Vigano was central to this story as well, having been engaged in similar work for Benedict XVI before being sent to the United States as the ambassador or papal nuncio for the Vatican. What an intricate web this is, and one that involves funds just mysteriously appearing at the right place in the right time. Needless to say, when Becciu was dismissed, Pell publicly thanked Francis for taking action to address the Becciu situation, calling it a cleaning of the stables. I suppose we'll see how far this really goes, especially in light of that account being central to the story. But Vigano has a different letter and a different take on this stables cleaning operation. It is about Cardinal Becciu. Here's a summary of that. In short, Vigano actually suggests that dismissals of this kind involving Becciu and Uncle Ted are actually not good for the Church. This isn't because of our notions of process and the like, but because it helps to feed this image of Francis cleaning the stables, which Vigano categorically rejects on the grounds that Becciu and Uncle Ted were not the only figures like this who worked closely with Francis. Vigano says now, and even back in his first testimony in the summer of 2018, that there are a lot of figures like this close to Francis, including one named Zanchetta, who had been brought to the Vatican and kept close to Francis, despite some pretty unsavory details emerging from Argentina about him. Zanchetta is de facto in charge of the patrimony of the Holy See, according to Vigano, and that's not getting talked much about widely either. So while we pay attention to Cardinal Becciu, Vigano asks us to keep an eye on Zanchetta, and to ask why that situation remains as it is. Vigano's central point is that these stables have in fact not been cleaned at all. Cardinal Becciu used papal funds to support a losing real estate deal in London and a movie about Elton John of all things. Neither of these activities are what we'd consider the typical use of resources of the Holy Father, yet there it is. So what happened? And in truth, we'll probably never find out. But all reports are that Francis's famous temper has been unleashed on Becciu, and for some reason that pleases me. But let me know your thoughts on this in the comments, please. Thanks for listening. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.